In 1978, Jimmy Burke stole $6 million in the largest heist in American history. But he didn't go to prison for the millions. He died in a cage because he was too cheap to split $5,000 with his best friend. Most gangsters kill for honor or for revenge. Jimmy the Gent killed to save a buck. If you lent him money, you didn't get interest, you got a bullet in the back of the head. He turned his dinner partners into police statistics one by one simply because he refused to open his wallet. Today, we're going to expose how the greed of one man destroyed the most powerful crew in New York. This isn't a story about a criminal mastermind, it is the story of the cheapest hitman who ever lived. To understand the butchery, you have to look at the money. $6 million, cash. It was a fortune that should have set every man involved up for life. They should have retired to private islands. They should have been drinking champagne on yachts. But Jimmy Burke didn't look at that mountain of cash and see a retirement fund for his friends. He saw a simple mathematical equation. Every man who helped him steal that money was a liability who could testify against him. But more importantly, every man who was alive was a man who expected a share. Jimmy realized that if he killed the crew, he wouldn't just be safer, he would be $6 million richer. And so the celebration didn't last. The slaughter began. But the most terrifying part of this story isn't the millions he stole. It is the fact that Jimmy Burke, a man sitting on a fortune that most people couldn't spend in 10 lifetimes, eventually murdered his close business partner over a dispute involving a few $1,000s. This is the story of a man whose greed was so pathological, so consuming, that he put a price tag on loyalty, and that price was zero. James Burke was a paradox. To the outside world, he was a charming, generous figure. They called him Jimmy the Gent because he had a habit of tipping everyone. He would give the doorman a 50, he would slip a $100 bill to a waiter just for bringing extra ice. He cultivated this image of a benevolent patriarch, a man who took care of his people. But this was a mask. Beneath the cheap suits and the cash tips, Jimmy Burke was a predator. He didn't view other human beings as people. He viewed them as containers of value. Either you had money he could take, or you could do a job for him. Once you were empty, you were nothing. He discarded people the way most men discard a used matchstick, without ceremony, without guilt, and without a second glance. Most gangsters operate on a code. You don't kill civilians. You don't kill members of your own crew unless they break the rules. Jimmy Burke operated on a different frequency. His only loyalty was to the ledger. If you owed him money, you were in danger. But if he owed you money, you were already dead. This is a critical distinction that many of the men around him failed to understand until it was too late. They thought they were partners. They thought they were brothers. They didn't realize that to Jimmy, they were just creditors. And Jimmy Burke had a very specific way of settling his debts. He didn't write checks. He cleared the ledger with a revolver. The Lufthansa heist was the moment that fully exposed this dark logic. When the news broke that they had successfully stolen millions, the crew was ecstatic. The air at Robert's Lounge was electric. They were slapping each other on the back, dreaming of the cars they would buy, the houses, the vacations, the freedom that kind of money was supposed to buy. They genuinely believed their lives had just changed forever. And they were right. Their lives did change, just not in the way they imagined. But while they were celebrating, Jimmy was already doing the math. The heist had been messy. There were too many people involved. 13, maybe 14 people knew enough to send Jimmy to prison for the rest of his life, and every single one of them was expecting a cut. Consider the case of Marty Krugman. Marty was a bookmaker, a frantic guy who actually tipped Jimmy off about the heist. Without Marty, there is no Lufthansa score. In any other business, Marty would be entitled to a finder's fee. He expected $500,000, a fair price for a $6 million tip. But Marty made a fatal error. He started asking for his money. He pestered Jimmy. He demanded what was rightfully his. Jimmy didn't see a partner asking for a fair share. He saw a man trying to take $500,000 out of his pocket. Jimmy killed Marty Krugman not because Marty was a rat. He killed him because it was cheaper than paying him. The logic is terrifyingly simple. A bullet costs 50 cents. Marty wanted $500,000. The return on investment for that murder was astronomical. Then there were Louis Kafora and his wife. The movie Goodfellas portrays Louis as a fool who bought a pink Cadillac and drew too much attention. And that is true, he was flashy, he was a liability. But looking closer at the timeline, you see the pattern. Louis had bought that car with his share of the advance money, but he was still owed a massive chunk of the final take. When Jimmy had him and his wife disappear, he didn't just solve a security problem, he absorbed their shares back into the pot. He consolidated the wealth. It became a cleaning operation. Jimmy was scrubbing the books, erasing the names of anyone who had a claim to the fortune. But the most chilling example, the one that truly reveals the depth of Jimmy Burke's depravity, involves a man named Richard Eaton. Richard wasn't a street soldier like the others. He was a hustler, a con man, a guy who worked the fringes of the mob. He wasn't involved in the Lufthansa heist directly, but he was part of Jimmy's inner circle. He was a friend.
They did business together, they drank together, they laughed together at the same tables in the same bars in Queens. Richard Eaton made the mistake of thinking that his friendship with Jimmy meant something. In the aftermath of the heist, while Jimmy was laundering money, he entrusted Richard Eaton with $250,000 for a cocaine deal in Fort Lauderdale. It was supposed to be easy money. But Richard Eaton played a dangerous game. He either kept the money or set up a fake deal where the money was stolen. He came back to Jimmy with empty hands and a sad story. He thought, it's Jimmy, we're friends. He'll be mad, but he won't kill me over a bad deal. He was wrong. Jimmy Burke didn't just get mad, he got even. But he didn't do it immediately. That was the scary part about Jimmy. He could smile at you while planning your funeral. He lured Richard Eaton to a meeting, likely with the promise of fixing the mess. When Eaton arrived, he was beaten, strangled, and frozen. His body was found later, discarded like trash in a freezer truck. Jimmy didn't just want him dead, he wanted him to suffer for the lost money. But the story gets even darker when you look at the smaller amounts. There are stories from associates of the time that Jimmy was killing people for debts as low as a few $1,000s. There was a story circulated among the crew about a friend who borrowed $5,000 from Jimmy to cover a gambling debt. When the time came to pay, the guy was a little short. He asked for an extension. Jimmy hugged him, told him not to worry about it, and said they would work it out. 2 days later, the guy was found with 2 bullets in the back of his head. Jimmy saved the $5,000 he had lent out, and he kept whatever money the guy had in his pocket at the time of the meeting. It was absolute, total predation. This level of cheapness is almost hard to comprehend. We are talking about a man who had literally millions of dollars buried in PVC pipes in the ground. He had enough money to buy anything he wanted. And yet, the idea of losing $5,000 or paying a partner their fair share caused him physical pain. It was a sickness. Greed had rewired his brain. He had become a black hole that swallowed everything around him. This behavior terrified Henry Hill. Henry is the narrator of the famous movie, the guy who eventually turned into a witness. In the film, Henry flips because he is caught with drugs and fears the other mobsters will kill him. That is true, but the specific fear was directed at Jimmy. Henry Hill knew Jimmy better than anyone. He had spent decades at his side, eating at his table, working his schemes, sharing his secrets. He watched Jimmy cry at the funerals of the men he had murdered. He watched Jimmy comfort the widows knowing full well he had the murder weapon in his basement. Henry realized a terrifying truth. I am worth more to Jimmy dead than I am alive. Henry knew where the bodies were. He knew about the Lufthansa money. He knew about the point-shaving scandals. He was a walking encyclopedia of Jimmy Burke's crimes. But more importantly, Henry realized that Jimmy was running out of money. The Lufthansa cash was hot. It was hard to spend. Jimmy was burning through cash on legal fees. Henry realized that Jimmy was looking at him and seeing a piggy bank. If Jimmy killed Henry, he didn't have to worry about Henry testifying, and he could keep whatever money they had generated together. It wasn't about loyalty, it was about the ledger. Henry Hill went to the FBI because he knew that friendship was a currency that Jimmy Burke did not accept.
The downfall of Jimmy Burke is a study in irony. For a man who spent his entire life killing to avoid paying debts, he died in the most pathetic way possible.
He was eventually convicted, not for the Lufthansa heist. They could never firmly pin that on him because he had killed everyone who could testify, but for the murder of Richard Eaton, the scam artist friend he killed over money. The system finally caught him because of his own pettiness. If he had just forgiven the debt, if he had just let Richard Eaton live, he might have stayed free. But he couldn't do it. His nature was his trap. Jimmy Burke died in 1996 at the Roswell Park Cancer Institute. He was 64 years old. By the end, he was a shadow of the man who once ruled Queens. The millions from Lufthansa, gone, vanished. To this day, nobody knows exactly what happened to the bulk of that cash. Some say it was spent on bribes. Some say it is still rotting in a hole in the ground somewhere in Queens. Jimmy never got to enjoy his retirement. He never got his yacht. He died alone, coughing his lungs out in a prison ward, chained to a bed. There were no friends at his bedside. Why would there be? He had killed them all. He had murdered the people who loved him, the people who trusted him. He had traded human connection for numbers on a page, and in the end, the numbers didn't show up to say goodbye. Not a single soul came to mourn the man who once tipped everyone. The story of Jimmy Burke is not a cool gangster story. It is not a story about being a good fella. It is a horror story about what happens when a human being loses the ability to value anything other than profit. We often glamorize these men in movies. We look at the suits, the cars, the power. But the reality of James Burke destroys that romance. The reality is a man who would invite you to dinner, pour you a drink, ask about your kids, and then shoot you in the back of the head because he wanted to keep the cash in your wallet. This brings us back to the $5,000. It seems like such a small amount. In the world of high-stakes crime, it is a rounding error. But that small amount is the key to the whole mystery. It proves that there was no master plan. There was no grand strategy. There was only an endless, insatiable hunger. Jimmy Burke was like a shark that keeps eating even when it isn't hungry, simply because it sees blood in the water. When you watch the movie Goodfellas now, look at Robert De Niro's eyes. He does a fantastic job of playing the paranoia, but he plays Jimmy as a man who is conflicted. The real Jimmy Burke wasn't conflicted. He slept soundly. He didn't have nightmares about the friends he murdered. He felt justified. In his mind, the money belonged to him, and anyone who tried to touch it was stealing. The lesson of Jimmy Burke is a dark one, and it deserves to be heard. It teaches us that in the criminal underworld, there is no such thing as honor among thieves. That is a myth invented by writers and storytellers to sell books. In the real world, thieves are simply people who steal, and if they're willing to steal from total strangers, they're willing to steal from their friends. When the real pressure is on, when the FBI is watching, and the money is on the table, the masks come off, and what is revealed underneath is the ugly, naked face of greed. So the next time you hear someone talk about the glory days of the mafia, remember Jimmy Burke. Remember the bodies in the meat trucks. Remember the friends strangled in cars. Remember the gent who tipped the doorman $50 with one hand and pulled the trigger with the other. He stands as a monument to the ultimate futility of crime. He stole more money than anyone else in American history, and he died with nothing to show for it. He killed to protect himself, and he died in a cage. He tried to win the game, but he didn't realize that the game was rigged against him from the start. If you enjoyed this dive into the dark reality behind the movies, make sure you are subscribed. We don't just tell you the legend, we show you the receipts. We dig into the police reports, the court transcripts, and the real history that Hollywood is too afraid to show you. The stories that never make it into the trailers. The details that get cut from the scripts because they are too ugly, too raw, too human. Next week, we are going to look at another legend of the underworld, a man who claimed to be a king but ended up a pawn. You won't want to miss it. Until then, remember, never trust a man who smiles too much, especially if he owes you money.